well as rapper and actor. I do everything. Oh, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone, for the warm welcome. It's been a wonderful day getting to meet all of you and to speak with a lot of you, particularly the young people. I do want to apologize to all the parents whose children have now come up to you and told you, Reza said that I don't have to be a doctor. I'm sorry about that.
Well, now that I've built you up, I'm just going to go straight in and start challenging you.
Okay.
So earlier today in your session, you had said to not go head on and attack the mainstream media, the Islamic phobic mainstream media. I believe that was your exact words. So my question for you is this. The mainstream media is a reflection of people's views, correct? I'd like to, how can other Muslims be Reza Aslan? Because we see you being so successful. So how can we incorporate ourselves into the media?
Yeah, first of all, please do not use me as an example, really, of anything. No, but I do think that, I was talking about the uselessness of dealing with particularly cable news and how I think our efforts can be better served looking at other ways, other platforms of addressing what is a very real negative sentiment among Americans in this country. I said that anti-Muslim sentiments in the United States are higher than they have ever recorded. That's a Washington Post poll. They've been taking polls on Americans' views of Islam and Muslims every single year since October of 2001. And every single year, that number has gotten higher and higher. And this year, the poll showed that I believe it's now 58% of Americans have a negative view of Islam. 2/3 of Americans, nearly 66% of Americans, believe that American and Islamic values inherently conflict with each other. And 1/3 of Americans, about 35% of Americans, believe that Muslims should be forced to carry special IDs, identifying them as Muslims. That's the reality that we are facing right now. And the media is a reflection of that reality, far more so than the media, I think, creates that reality. It's a symbiotic relationship, unquestionably, but it is a very real problem that American Muslims are dealing with. And I think that part of this, we have to understand, is manufactured. Those of you familiar with the great work the Center for American Progress has done and the report that they issued a few years back called Fear Inc., which they've updated this year, they have indicated how clearly that the link for Americans' negative views towards Muslims is linked not necessarily to the attacks of 9/11. As a matter of fact, these numbers that I'm talking about didn't really begin to surge until 2006, 2007, 2008, really coming to a head at around 2010 during the elections and the whole mosque at Ground Zero controversy. You remember that thing that was neither a mosque nor a Ground Zero? Remember that thing? And I think for a lot of us, we know exactly who we're talking about when we're talking about this manufactured sentiment. This is a very small handful of organizations, individuals that have been funded now to the tune of about $60 million from various organizations and foundations to essentially create this sense of overwhelming fear about Muslims in the United States. This idea that the 1% of the population of America that is Muslim is on the verge of a complete takeover, which is absurd. I mean, maybe when we get to 2% we'll take over, but 1%, we got a ways to go. And some of these people you know very well. These are the names that show up over and over again in the media. People like Robert Spencer or Pamela Geller, Frank Gaffney, Daniel Pikes, these pseudo-scholars who have grown enormously wealthy in feeding this fear machine. these groups that they run that have been designated by the Anti-Defamation League, by the Southern Poverty Law Center, by the federal government itself as hate groups. They've really managed to create, I think, a kind of anti-Islamic KKK, if you will. I guess that would be ha ha ha, I guess. And so there is an actual force out there that's feeding this machine, but the fact of the matter is that the negativity is very real, and it is something that we have to deal with in some way.
That's perfect, because it leads to my second question, which is that you had mentioned earlier that Islamophobia, there's more Islamophobia today than immediately right after 9/11. Now, do you think that groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda are playing a role in this? And what do we as Muslims, how should we address that issue?
Well, I think there's no question that the violence that inundates our media, our TV screens on a nightly basis, and particularly the barbaric acts of these groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, is transforming people's opinions about Muslims. When the only Muslim that you know is the Muslim that you see on TV, then it's only natural that you create a direct link between that Muslim who's cutting off heads in Syria and the Muslim at the market next door. That's I think a natural result. And it's a result that comes primarily, as I was saying before, not from a sense of ignorance, but a sense of fear. And so I think that we have to figure out a way not just to create a counter-narrative for these narratives of violence. That's already happening. It's happening in robust ways, and it's happening in ways that are really divorced from the experience of most Americans. And so because they don't see it, they don't experience it, they think it's not happening. But it is very much a part of the Muslim experience. At the same time, however, I do think that we need to do a better job of confronting the way in which Americans think about our culture, our faith, our communities. I said that one of those ways of doing that earlier today is by actually using pop culture, pop media. That I think has a profound effect on the way that people think. But there are other ways to do this, and I think that we don't do a very good job of learning from the immigrant communities, the marginalized immigrant communities who came before us. No matter how bad you think Islamophobia is today, it's not anywhere in the same ballpark as the anti-Semitism that gripped this country in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. We passed laws in the United States trying to curb Jewish immigration into this country. It was perfectly mainstream thought for people to say that Jews were a fifth column in this country, that they were an insidious force in the United States. And this wasn't just sort of a fringe argument. These were some of the most well-established, well-respected individuals, people like Henry Ford, who we nowadays lionize as the icon of American ingenuity, who was a despicable anti-Semite, who published the Elders of the Protocols of Zion in his 8 nationwide newspapers and forced his dealerships to sell these papers as though it were news. People like Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh is an absolute hero in the American national consciousness. This man was an unapologetic anti-Semite who actually blamed the Jews for World War II, thought that the Holocaust was just a ruse in order to get American troops dragged into another world war. These were not fringe characters. These were the heroes of American culture. And this was standard mainstream rhetoric about Jews in this country. And yet, fast forward 50, 60 years, and Jews are as much a part of the religious, cultural fabric of this country as anyone else. So much so that we constantly hear about how this country is predicated on Judeo-Christian values, which, by the way, if you are not a scholar of religion and you don't know what Judeo-Christian means, it means Protestant. That's what it means. I've never in my life heard a Jew use the word Judeo-Christian. But nevertheless, the point of all this is how? How did that happen? Jews make up 2% of the population of this country. How is it possible that this marginalized, suppressed, oppressed community has managed to integrate itself so fully? Well, it didn't have to do with people learning about Judaism. I'll tell you that right now. Again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I completely recognize and I understand the impulse of my Muslim brothers and sisters who constantly say that, you know, if we could just teach Americans more about Islam, then they won't fear us as much, as though you've never actually met an American before. That's not how Americans change their minds. They don't. It's not like they began to accept Jews because they learned about Judaism. Americans don't know anything about Judaism that they didn't learn from Seinfeld. They accepted Jews because of, I think, a number of very important steps that Jews themselves took. One of those steps I already talked about, by becoming thought leaders, art leaders, by understanding how Americans change their views and by putting their talents to use in that way, by integrating Jewish stories, Jewish culture, values, and mores into the larger American consciousness through books, through the arts, through television and film and music. That had a huge role to play in it. But it wasn't the only thing that happened. I think there was other issues that we have to keep in mind. Number one is that they became integrated into the American political spectrum, right? And I think that is something that is really lacking in our community. Now, I don't know, maybe it's because so many of us, I mean, about 2/3 of America's Muslim population, this is a remarkable number, by the way, about 2/3 of America's Muslim population are first-generation Muslims. That's astounding. That's really an astounding fact to think about. We're a very young community. Yes, it's true the first Muslims who came to the United States came here on slave ships. That's true. Yes, it's true that Muslims have been a part of this country from the very beginning, before there was the United States. But the fact of the matter is that there has been a tremendous surge over the last 2-3 decades of Muslim immigration, and that immigration has transformed this country. And a lot of the anti-Muslim sentiment that we see is also anti-immigrant sentiment. That is important to understand. Nevertheless, I think because so many of us have left countries like myself, in which politics or political participation is not a real thing. You know, certainly you vote, but you don't look to your government to solve your problems when you're in Iran. You don't look to your government to solve your problems when you live in Pakistan. And so I think that we have this strange view about the role that government should play in our lives. And so we vote, sure, we support candidates, but we're not really integrated into our political system in the robust way that we should be. For instance, we know that the American Muslim community is enormously wealthy. Actually, the median income for a Muslim household in America is larger than it is for a non-Muslim household. JWT, the advertising giant, in 2010 issued a report saying that the combined annual income of America's Muslim and Middle Eastern communities is $170 billion. $billion. We have the highest rates, as an immigrant community, the absolute highest rates of literacy and the highest rates of education. Also, as an immigrant community, Muslims in this country have the #1 highest rates of citizenship rate in this country. So, we're fully integrated. We're as much a part of America as anyone else, and yet we still haven't figured out this one thing, which is how this country works. And the way this country works, unfortunately, is through money. The Supreme Court of the United States told us not too long ago that your money is your voice. Literally, your money is your voice. And yet we constantly complain about how voiceless we are in our politics when we see, the GOP presidential candidates stumbling upon themselves to see which can be most bigoted towards Muslims. You know, Herman Cain, I would never let a Muslim serve in my cabinet. Newt Gingrich, I can beat that. I'm going to pass a constitutional amendment outlawing Sharia in America. You know, I mean, it's like, who can be more despicable? We watch that and we lament and we say, wow, our voice isn't heard. Your voice isn't heard. Your money is your voice. And $170 billion is a very loud voice. You know what the American Jewish community did to anti-Semitic politicians? They punished them. They made sure that they lost. We don't do that. We look at these politicians who preach the most vile anti-Muslim rhetoric, and we sort of throw up our hands as though we can't do anything about it. We can do something about it, but we don't. We don't use our money in the right way, I don't think, to actually change the way this country talks about us, to punish those who dare speak about us in bigoted and racist ways, and to reward those who don't. So that's the first step beyond popular media. Second step, I think, is equally important and equally lacking in the American Muslim community. When the Jewish community in this country was faced with that overwhelming and absolutely mainstream anti-Semitism, they didn't sit around sort of, lamenting about it. They didn't cry about it. Instead, what they did was something I think profoundly American. They began to be at the forefront of everyone else's human rights struggle. Who was at the forefront? What non-African Americans who were at the forefront of the civil rights movement? It was Jews who were at the forefront of that movement. Who was at the forefront of the feminist movement in this country in the 60s and 70s? Jews. It was Jews. Who was at the forefront of the anti-war movement in this country? It was Jews. I think the American Jewish community has done a marvelous job recognizing that the absolute truth of sort of America is that if you stand up for everyone else, people will start to stand up for you. Now, we have marvelous organizations, communities, MSAs, who do wonderful work fighting for Muslim rights around the world, and that's great. But until we figure out how to make everybody else's problem our problem, we're always going to be seen as other. The more internalized we become, the more we focus on our own problems, our own community's needs, which are real and important, the more we're going to be seen as outsiders. So I travel around the country, I talk to a lot of MSAs, and I constantly talk to them, and they, ask them what they're doing, and they always say, well, we're having an Islam Awareness Week. That's good. We're doing a Palestine thing. Okay, that's great. What about, an issue on global warming? Anything about that? Anything about poverty in America? Where were the Muslims during the riots in Ferguson, and these enormous amount of racism that has now gripped the police force throughout this country? Where are Muslims? Why aren't Muslims at the forefront of that? This isn't just about getting people to think differently about us. This is what our faith demands. What I was taught by Imam Hussein and by his sacrifice is that your job, your duty is to stand up for everyone who cannot stand up for themselves. Everyone. Not just Muslims, everyone. Even if you don't agree with their politics, even if you don't agree with their worldview or their values, that's not the point. That is the lesson that we're supposed to learn from Karbala. That even unto our death, we will stand up for justice for everyone. And if we don't do that, if we continue to be sort of, internalized and focused inward, I don't think that we can actually transform the way that this country looks at us.
That's interesting that you said. It's interesting that you said that money is what runs America.
Yeah,
I actually thought it was Fox News.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Money runs Fox News.
Money runs Fox News. I really believe Abu Jahab started a TV station, it'd be Fox News.
No, but no, in all honesty, I did this fundraiser in Houston. There were a lot of wealthy brothers in Houston, let me tell you. And I was sitting at this table with, captains of industries and CEOs and all this, and one of them asked me, this guy had sold his company and got a $200 million severance check or something. And he was like, what can we do, with the elections coming up, what can we do to make sure that, our issues are being addressed? I was like, why are you asking me for? You're rich. Do you not know how this country works? I mean, if Sheldon Adelson, right? Sheldon Adelson can say that I will spend $10 million, myself, $100 million, he said actually, I'll spend $100 million on whoever is the most pro-Zionist candidate to make sure that he becomes president. Where's the Muslim Sheldon Adelson? Where's the Muslim Sheldon Adelson to say, you know what? I will pay money. I will pay $10 million. You got $200 million? $10 million is not a big deal. I'll pay $10 million for any GOP candidate who tries to, as hard as possible, be as unbigoted as he possibly can, towards Muslims. Where is that candidate? It's so easy for us to manipulate our political leaders. It just costs money. And that may be disgusting, it may be ugly, it's also true. So stop complaining about it and pay for it instead.
Since you talked about the presidential election, the last presidential election, much was made about President Obama and his religion. Is he a secret Muslim? Is he not? What about his father? All these topics came up. However, in the next election, we'll have topics like that. They're not the exact issue, but you will have.
I think everyone's going to be like, is Hillary a secret Muslim? She might be.
But in one way or another, Muslims will be front and center, the topic of Muslims. And,
Yes.
So how do you think Muslims will play in the coverage of the 2016 election, and how can Muslims capitalize on this attention?
I mean, I think first of all, if I could just say something about President Obama. I always love this whole thing about how Obama is a secret Muslim. Like, if he's a secret Muslim, he's terrible at it. Right? He's like the worst Muslim. It'd be great if he would say something every once in a while, but whatever. And this, by the way, goes a lot towards what I was saying earlier this afternoon about how bigotry is not about knowledge. I mean, it's to this day, 46% of GOP still believes that President Obama is a Muslim. There's nothing that he can do. There's nothing that he can say at all. If Jesus Christ himself came down and said, he's not a Muslim, that 46% would be like, a Jew and a Muslim. So again, that goes back to what I was saying about the limits of information when you're fighting bigotry. To this other point though, I think that you're going to hear a lot of anti-Muslim bigotry among the GOP field because it's necessary. It's fodder for their audience. And in the same way that you saw in 2012 with the most disgusting rhetoric coming out of that camp. And good for Mitt Romney because he never played along. He never played along with that. When you had candidate after candidate after candidate talking about how they wouldn't let Muslims serve in their cabinet. Newt Gingrich famously said, I wouldn't let any Muslims serve in my cabinet. I mean, heck, during World War II, we wouldn't let any Nazis serve in the American cabinet. Did you catch that? Not during World War II, we wouldn't have Germans serve in our cabinet. We wouldn't have Nazis serve, because if you let a Muslim serve in your cabinet, obviously he's Al-Qaeda, right? It's the same thing. And by the way, that got him votes. He came out of that debate with far more votes than he had before. And when Mitt Romney was asked the same question, he shrugged his shoulders and said, "This is America. There's no such thing as a religious test for office in America." And I'm hoping that is what we're going to see from the front runners. And I do think that we will, but I do think that the rest of the field is going to descend into this. That said, when it comes to the actual general election, when it's between, Hillary and Jeb or whatever it may be, we are irrelevant. They will never bring us up because they don't care. I mean, they don't care. 3 million votes doesn't matter. There are only 3 million of us, and it doesn't matter. And we've shown that we're not much of a political threat. Do you know the last time that a presidential candidate actively courted the Muslim vote was? Do you know what it is? Remember? Our best friend, George W. Bush, in the year 2000. And he got the overwhelming majority of Muslim votes in this country simply because he bothered to ask. Now, if only we knew. But anyway, and I think that for the most part, honestly, I don't see that either candidate in the general election is going to bother with us because they don't take us seriously. They don't take us seriously. Again, there are 6 million Jews in this country. That's also a very small number. It's a very small number. It's insignificant. When you're talking about 120, 130 million votes, 6 million, it's not that big of a deal. And yet, they will be actively courted because they have put themselves in a position of power. And we've got to do the same so that we're relevant. Otherwise, we just won't be.
So, you're here in the conference with Imam Hussein. And Imam Hussein inspired so many of us to fight oppression. And being an expert historian, I'd like to ask you, do you think that Imam Hussein's message is still relevant today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that we have in the United States this kind of mythology about what it means to stand up for the poor and the weak and the dispossessed, what it means to sacrifice yourself for your country, for your beliefs. It's deeply embedded in the American consciousness. The story that we tell ourselves about what this country is, how it was founded, what it means. And those are precisely the values that, for me, come out of Karbala. And so, in a sense, that message, that example, is as resonant today as it's ever been. But it needs to be, I think, much more on the foreground. I think the vast majority of Americans, even those who are fairly familiar with Islam, don't know anything about Imam Hussein, have never heard of him, don't know anything about his story, and it's a compelling story. It's one that has to be told. I'm very glad to see this film project that we learned about earlier today. I think that's a good first step. But I think writing books, teaching young people, making it a part of the larger American story is precisely what I'm talking about in this sort of the way that we can integrate our values into the American culture.
And, ladies and gentlemen, in this day and age, the mainstream media and celebrities are looking at every opportunity to attack Islam. They're wanting to portray Islam as a terroristic and barbaric religion, and they're using vehicles like ISIS and Al-Qaeda to justify this notion. In this day and age, people are fearful of their reputation and will not stand up for Islam. But there's one, Dr. Reza Aslan, who is actually in the forefront, defending Islam against the likes of Bill Maher, CNN, Fox News. And what I'd like to say is thank you. Thank you, and keep on doing what you've been doing, brother. Thank you. Now you can finally eat. Now you can finally eat. I'd like to invite everyone to the grand celebration tonight, which will be in the main hall. And again, ladies and gentlemen, help me thank Reza Aslan.